Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sharon Hewson at AEE. Welcome to our first member webinar of March. Thank everyone for joining us today. We do actually have a couple of other webinars coming up in March that I just wanted to make you guys aware of quickly before I go ahead and introduce today's webinar. So let me just bring that screen into view. Let me just escape from this one. And if you look right here under the member section under benefits, you can see upcoming webinars, and you can see that today we have James Johnson, and I'll give you a bit more detail on that one in just a moment. Next week on Tuesday, we have Eric Woodruff introducing our new CEM training program. All material has been updated, and he's going to give you the highlights and overview of that new program. And then also towards the end of March on the 27th, we have Brady Nemeth, who will be talking about the future of lighting efficiency. So you can go to the AE website, and as I said, if you go up to membership and chapters at the top and select benefits, you will see all of these upcoming webinars, and you can just go ahead and click on the register. So we would love for you all to join us for those. Okay, so today we have James Johnson, who is a project manager for KW Engineering, and he is going to be talking about the best practices for LED retrofits. So James Johnson is a project manager and a lighting subject matter expert at KW Engineering. He's worked in the energy engineering space for the last 10 years, and at KW, James is responsible for energy audits, retro commissioning studying, and implementation assistance for customers in the commercial, industrial, and government sectors. So I am going to go ahead and pass control over to you, James.
Excellent. Great. I am showing my screen.
Looks good.
There we go. All right, great. All right, so welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about best practices for LED lighting retrofits. The intent of today's talk is to give us some more implementation-focused recommendations as opposed to discussing the benefits of LEDs or the nature of the types of efficiency improvement we're going to achieve. So that should get you more or less in the ballpark of what we'll be talking about. Shannon's already given a brief overview about my background, so I'm going to skip that. And so the one thing that I will kind of broadly talk about is why we do retrofit and relighting. You know, the big motivator for most of my customers is particularly saving money. Although reducing emissions in California, it tends to be a pretty heavy motivator. The other benefit that I think I certainly as an energy professional tend to undervalue is visual impacts and worker productivity. Those tend to have, those swords can cut both ways. If we improve visual impact, that's great, we're adding value. But at the same time, when we're doing a retrofit, we want to make sure that that retrofit isn't going to negatively impact either the visual appearance of the space or worker productivity. And that gets to the one of the rules of thumb I like to cite a lot is the 3-30-300 rule, which states that for every $3 a property owner or manager spends on energy in the building, they spend about $30 per square foot in terms of real estate costs and $300 per square foot in terms of salary. So a small change in productivity is going to generally wipe out or completely obliterate net cost savings, even when we're saving 50% of lighting energy, just because that's going to, if that project impacts productivity, it's going to have a negative impact on the bottom line. So one of the recurring themes that we'll talk about today is generally around productivity and visual impact and making sure things continue to look good while delivering those great energy savings. So, tips for retrofit success. So this is going to be sort of a rapid fire, sort of broad, high-level topics that I think can really deliver great projects. So the first one is, and it's kind of a no-brainer, is sort of knowing how you're going to be judged on your success, which means identifying the project timeline, the process appropriate for the customer, the application that the customer is working on, and all sorts of project data. So big picture ideas are sort of differences around in-house versus contracted labor. In-house labor, of course, generally has, at least on paper, an apparent lower cost. Generally speaking, when people evaluate in-house labor, they're evaluating sort of take-home pay, which would, is generally analogous to what people are seeing on a paycheck, versus what the owner is paying in terms of not only take-home pay, but things like insurance, sick leave, vacation time. All of those values get rolled up into what would be called a fully vested labor rate, which includes all those added costs. And so when you start including those added costs, your contracted rates for using an out-of-house third-party contractor actually start reaching parity with those in-house labor rates. And then things can get more sophisticated once you start thinking about more sophisticated lighting controls. A contractor who deals with that every day is probably going to be a little bit faster at setting those systems up, deploying the hardware, getting the hardware fully programmed, versus somebody who wears a whole bunch of different hats when it comes to facility maintenance. So it's something to keep in mind. And similarly, the ability to scale a retrofit. A lot of my clients tend to have very specialized cases where, say, if it is the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, that's definitely a different use case than, say, a local municipal gymnasium. Those municipal gymnasiums scale very easily. Very similar type of spaces, very similar type of activities. But some of those sort of other end uses like decorative or artistic lighting, those are going to have things that might not scale as easily. And so knowing how scale impacts your project is going to have a big impact on what sort of hardware retrofit process you're going to go through. Similarly, the contracting phase is always good. Often in lighting retrofits, it tends to be a design-build project where we're relying on the contractor to generally propose materials, and then once they get approval on the proposed materials, installing them. That is a very different approach than, say, using a design bid build where you have a designer on staff who's going to probably be a little bit more detail oriented on some of the visual aspects as opposed to maybe the efficiency aspects. So knowing those players and how they all work together is going to impact your project success. And of course, deliverables and time constraints. I do a lot of work with school districts, and we are generally confined to 3-month windows during the summer when everybody's off school for doing our retrofits. So when that's sort of a project constraint, we have to keep that in mind when we're designing the entire project to make sure that what we're delivering can actually be fully executed from that last day when the bell rings through basically the week before school starts and the teachers get on site to start prepping for the new year. Generally speaking, when you identify these constraints, the earlier you know about them, the more time you have to plan and accommodate them. So I'm always going to encourage my clients to think about these constraints before they're even on contract with me to start doing work. I want to make sure that these ideas are at least in their head and they're thinking about them. Other things that really impact successful implementation is nailing your site evaluation. That site evaluation is is basically your chance to get information. And so if you're on site, my biggest thing is to ask what the plans are going to for changing that space use. Generally speaking, we walk the space and we see it in a snapshot in time, and we want to know if that snapshot in time is representative of the planned use of the space, or even the annual use of that space. The use of each space and who's in it is going to impact what light levels we're going to shoot for, what kind of lighting is going to be acceptable. Generally speaking, there's a lot of details in terms of age of the population. Generally speaking, by the time you hit 40, and I'm rapidly approaching that, unfortunately, your visual acuity drops off by about 25% compared to what it was when you were 20. So knowing the age of the population is going to impact whether that population will perceive the space as being brighter or darker. And of course, all the IES, Illuminating Engineering Society, horizontal luminance recommendations are based now on the task that's being performed, not just the space type. And then, again, as a value add and a lever to get sort of that ball rolling is I want to know if the existing system is working and if what I'm identifying as opportunities are actually going to yield an improvement in function. If the function is improved, that is a great lever for doing an energy project where maybe the energy financial payback might be on the bubble. Well, if it solves a problem, it increases wow factor in the space. In a commercial real estate world, that might be at the final drop of water behind the dam that causes all those financial floodgates to open. Maintenance of lighting, of course, that's a big deal, especially with LED when we're talking about products that last substantially longer than our incumbent lighting technologies. At the same time, we want to think about our retrofits and what the maintenance implications are. For example, I had a customer contact me last night about using a CFL LED retrofit module. And he was like, well, $17 for just this LED lamp that'll work in this fixture. Is this a good idea? And I looked at it, I'm like, it's an all right product, but the ceilings are 20 feet high. I think it just based on the labor rates that they use for their maintenance staff, it made more sense to go with a $50 can retrofit, which would last almost twice as long as the LED module and would therefore have one fewer relamping efforts, and the cost of getting the lift in there and marshaling materials to get them on site. It actually paid back just on the maintenance benefit. So if you're able to quantify those things, again, it's another lever to get the ball rolling. And then, all the things related to energy, those still matter because, again, a lot of these projects are justified based on the energy savings alone. So you're going to want to get all the standard energy details, air type, power, run hours, all those good details. Knowing who's on your team is a big benefit. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but knowing who you're going to be influencing means you can start thinking about what phrases, levers, concerns you can apply to the people on the project to get them to implement your ideas, your recommendations. So if it's, for example, when you deal with Silicon Valley tech companies, we're selling the controllability factors. We're talking about worker productivity a whole lot more than when we're talking to school districts. School districts are looking for things that are easily maintained, and so we're generally working with the facility manager. So I'm thinking about and trying to sell products that are going to make their life easier from a maintenance perspective. And then knowing the other members of the team can help you leverage their subject matter expertise. An electrical distributor might be able to tell you, what options are available in terms of or equals. So what sort of things might they bid as an or equal, so you can start planning that when you're putting together your product specifications. Utility reps are going to keep you in touch with incentives. They all have sort of a stake to share in the project. So it's a good idea to try and get to know the project team before the project starts. The other big benefit that we see, again, kind of in this site evaluation stage, is noting and where our measurements are taken and recording them with a lot of detail. It's for me, it struck me first as a pain in the neck, but really once you have that documentation on hand and you can recreate it, but after the retrofit, and if the customer starts having issues with tenants making complaints, having that information that things have not changed substantially is a great way of making sure that you're not putting your neck out there and accepting unnecessary risk. So my big things are to mark where I measure work plane illuminances on a map, and then I'm not only marking the illuminance, I'm marking where it was taken and at what height. Ideally, I'm marking that on a furniture plan. Sometimes that doesn't exist, and I'll give you a little example of what we do when we don't have a good furniture plan. And then similarly, we're also taking a lot of pictures. And you want to be mindful of your camera exposure settings. You can make a space look artificially bright or artificially dark based on your ISO exposure setting on your camera. So make sure you're taking pictures with similar exposure settings. Auto exposure is going to make your pictures look the best regardless of the light level, but when you're doing auto exposure pre and post for a space which is going to have a different exposure requirement, is going to make your picture probably not actually representative. And similar to the light levels, we're going to mark and note where we took pictures from, so that way when we go back post to take similar pictures, we're taking them at roughly the same locations. So this is an example sort of form of what we do. Is we took the reflected ceiling plan and we marked down where we were taking light levels and light meter readings. Some of the spaces had some pretty particular use cases, and in those applications, we noted sort of what the cubicle or what this. So this was actually an office that they built inside of an open office. We kind of noted what the layout was, so that way when we were coming back post case, if I wasn't available, another engineer could take those identical light levels. And then we noted them all on the table that provided not only the light level, but it also provided a description of what was occurring in the space. So generally speaking, you're going to want to take horizontal and potentially vertical. Vertical comes up a lot less often, but horizontal definitely. And you're going to want to coordinate that horizontal illuminance recording with where the IES says the work plane is. So for example, in a basketball court, the work plane is at 3 foot high, not the sort of standard 2 foot 6 inches. And for example, if you're talking about lighting on a sidewalk next to a building, there's a horizontal work plane on the floor, but there's also a vertical work plane at around 5 feet above the ground, vertically or perpendicular to the ground along the path of travel. So knowing these are all spelled out in the IES handbook and in the supported recommended practices. So I encourage you to use those as a lever. The IES also has some really great recommendations for how to take light meter readings. Generally speaking, all the rules of thumb that apply. You don't want to shade it using your body, but you also want to kind of think about dark spots and light spots and make sure you're measuring a representative sample of both. I had an intern last summer take some light meter readings for me, and I said, find the dark spots and the light spots. And she found every dark spot in the corners of the hallways, even though nobody traveled there. So it's not necessarily the dark spots and as the darkest dark spots, but actually the dark spots in terms of where people generally travel. So in that hallway, I was thinking more along the lines of directly underneath fixtures and between fixtures, as sort of the bright spots being directly under the fixtures and the dark spots being the locations where equidistant to each of the adjacent light fixture. The other thing that I think can trip some people up is not properly evaluating the lamp lumen depreciation and the lamp dirt depreciation. When we're going in and we're working in existing buildings, a lot of those lighting systems have some sort of light output depreciation. What does that mean? That means they're not producing as much light as they would otherwise normally be producing. I've done a lot of warehouse lighting retrofit projects where the lamps are probably they're being replaced on burnout, and as a result, the lamps that continue to run tend to have a really low light output relative to new lamps. And so when you compare the old light output with lamps that are well beyond their expected useful life and a new LED lighting product, of course that LED lighting product is going to look much brighter. But LED lighting products should be designed for their end-of-life lumen depreciation, which generally speaking is a 30% light loss. That's how we get the L70 lamp life. So if we're having a 30% light loss and we're comparing it against a system that's been allowed to depreciate more than it should, you might not actually have a true apples-to-apples comparison. The same thing applies with the fixture cleanliness. Again, when a customer has generally been skipping out on their lighting maintenance, they're also not getting up there to wipe away dirt, dust bunnies, all sorts of debris that could otherwise obscure or reduce the effectiveness of the optical system. So you want to make sure that you're including lamp dirt depreciation in your analysis. As sort of a general rule of thumb, in most interior environments where there's, it's not an iron foundry, it's not a gas station where there's a lot of particulate matter. After about 8 years of no cleaning, you're going to have about an 8%, 6 to 8% light loss just from dirt. And then, depending on how often you're running your lighting system, for an LED lighting product that runs continuously around the clock, after 8 years, you're probably nearing 40-ish thousand hours, in which case we'd expect the lighting system to have lost about 20% of the lamp lumens that would otherwise be produced for an LED product. So keeping these ideas in mind and designing it as appropriate is going to make sure that you head off any problems down the line. The big benefit, of course, for us as the energy geeks is we're thinking about, is the lighting system efficient? So a lot of these efficiency issues relate to, are there controls in the room? We want to minimize run hours as much as you can. And even if there are controls in the room, not making the assumption that they're functioning properly. I've done quite a few technology studies with some of the utilities out here in California where we look at existing lighting controls and try and assess whether they're actually still working 5, 10, 15, 20 years after they were installed. And more often than not, they're not working as intended. And so we want to consider incorporating some easy functional tests into our strategies of doing lighting audits. So that way we can kind of assess, is this product working? Does it need to be replaced as part of the project? That's going to have a big outsized impact on your efficiency savings if the operating hours are substantially higher. Also, identifying what kind of lamps are in the room, what kind of ballasts. Of course, these issues, these are the things that can swap out of fixtures in and out pretty easily, and they may not be visible from the ground. So verifying some of these things with some spot checks, or check in at the lamp room with a maintenance tech who's familiar with what gets installed and what might be left in there from 20 years ago is a good idea. And of course, light levels, we want to tune the light levels. We want to keep in mind if we're doing lighting controls that we will probably have the ability to tune, especially if we're doing more advanced network lighting controls. We have those options available to us. And daylighting tends to be some of the harder things to look at. Generally speaking, when you look at a lobby that's got beautiful floor-to-ceiling windows, yeah, that's going to be easily daylit because the light level requirement in a lobby isn't very high, and there's nobody there who that's sort of their designated work area. It's a transient occupancy pattern. When you look at an open office area, you've got a little bit more politics, networking with the occupants to figure out how is a daylighting solution going to work there. So when evaluating daylighting, you want to kind of think about, pessimistically, how could this go wrong, and see if you can address that before you make a final recommendation. Maintenance is a huge variable. It runs the gamut through the lighting industry. Who does the maintenance? If it's in-house, great. That's a whole lot easier to attribute savings for. If it's done out of house, maybe it's a lighting maintenance contract. You want to talk about how often and when and how those contracts are triggered, because if they're triggered, that might have a net benefit to the customer. If they're sort of like an on-call maintenance, they call and they make a maintenance appointment. Whereas if the customer has a maintenance contract where it's just a fixed annual cost, there might not actually be a financial benefit to improving maintenance without renegotiating that contract. So keeping these things in mind allows you to ask the follow-up questions necessary to provide some accurate costing information, and making sure that when you move forward, you're appropriately attributing those savings. So, with that in mind, let's talk about lighting, the LED lighting and retrofit as applies to LED specifically. Everything we've talked about up to now kind of applies for any lighting technology, but now we're going to get into the specifics of LEDs. So this is sort of if you do nothing, follow this list. So always aim for a high LPW, don't aim for a high LPW. Aim high when setting your LPW. You want as low an LPW as possible. That said, you don't want to break the bank. You don't want to be going out to go and get the one or two manufacturers who are offering 180 lumen per watt LED package right now. It's that their marginal cost is much higher than what you would stand to save. So you want to aim high in terms of efficiency, but you want to keep it reasonable at the same time. So don't go out of your way to spend too much money to net an additional 5% savings. If you're going for incentives, you're going to want to check to make sure that the lighting products you're working with are on the Energy Star list or the Design Light Consortium qualified product list. Most utility incentive programs require lighting products to be on one of those two lists to get incentives. Of course, in California, a lot of our lighting incentives have shrunk over time as regulations have changed. So in California, that might not be as much of a lever on your project. So consider your location and what the regulatory framework is. You're also going to want to coordinate what you pick in terms of your LED products with your control intent. If you're using, for example, a system that uses dolly dimming, and there are a few manufacturers who use dolly dimming, some of them under specific trade names, you want to make sure that your LED products that you're selecting have that same sort of dimming functionality. That will have a big cost impact on your control intent, or on your control bill at the end if you don't coordinate those. And I always, I work with a lot of folks who might not have a whole lot of expertise in lighting, and they'll get these really great price quotes. And I always kind of have to say, okay, let's pump the brake a little bit and take a look at what's actually being proposed, because there are some folks out there who provide some what I consider too good to be true pricing, and usually there's some caveats involved, and generally speaking, the product quality doesn't hold up. So investigate those claims with a lot of caution. And I tend to discount warranty claims for new to market vendors. I've been doing a lot of stuff with LEDs for over the past 10 years, and I've certainly had some experiences where we've gone with a low price vendor, only to find out that once maintenance issues start popping up and we're making claims against the warranty, I've had at least a half dozen times where the manufacturer's gone out of business and there's no one there to service the warranty. So when those happens, not only does the customer get frustrated, a lot of that can kind of splash back on you as a lighting expert who kind of push them in that direction. Keeping those things in mind is usually a good call. I also like to assess my product lives based on parametric failure and catastrophic failure. For conventional light sources, we always thought catastrophic failure. Catastrophic failure is the lamp burns out, the ballast stops working, the lamp is no longer producing light. That's sort of the standard use case for most places. LED has the potential of actually having a parametric failure before it has a catastrophic failure, in which case the system is no longer producing enough light, even though the system does light up when the switch is turned on. So most LED products will list the L70 life. That is a parametric life. It's when the system has lost 30% of its initial output, we're saying that is the end of life of the product. We base that based on some human physiological curves that basically says most human beings cannot sense a light change that occurs gradually until you hit 30% of lighting reduction. Once you hit that 30% lighting reduction, people start being able to perceive that the light levels have changed, and they experience that as a less than positive thing. So when I say catastrophic failure, if we're going to have a lot of lamp switching, generally speaking, the lamps are not going to last as long, even if they are listed with 50,000, 100,000 hour product lives. The LRC did some really interesting study on retrofit lamps, and they basically found that the on-off cycling of inexpensive drivers causes the solder points for the individual electronic components inside the product to weaken over time due to thermal stress and causing an eventual catastrophic failure. So they did this with a whole bunch of, I think, A-line retrofit lamps like you might get at a big box retailer, and they found that the catastrophic failure rate was around 10,000 hours of rapid switching that you might experience in, say, a service closet or a restroom versus the listed 25,000 to 50,000 hour product lives. That research is ongoing. I haven't seen any additional research of that nature, but I'm doing this as sort of an abundance of caution to make sure that we're specifying good products. And of course, the biggest, sort of most overarching recommendation is to use good design principles. That means providing enough light, controlling contrast ratios, and making the visual environment comfortable by controlling glare. And we'll talk about all of these in a little bit more detail. So knowing your retrofit approach is a big one. There are generally three retrofits that I think of. Usually an engine retrofit, you might call that a lamp retrofit, where you're not really changing the optics of the fixture, the lion's share of the fixture staying in place. These tend to be the most inexpensive retrofits available, and in some cases they're a great solution, like this downlighting example. Going from an incandescent reflector lamp to an LED reflector lamp, that's a slam dunk. There's no question that the systems are probably going to be relatively equivalent in performance. Retrofit kits tend to include some amount of optical control, maybe not full optical control. You might have to make some sacrifices because you're working in sort of a retrofit form factor. But generally, you're going to remove the existing ballast, you're going to remove the existing lamp. You might end up removing some of the existing optics, in which case you're going to probably get a slightly better photometric efficiency, meaning a larger fraction of the generated light will exit the fixture. So you might end up on the whole, providing a more efficient lighting system. Even if the lamp light source has a high lumens per watt, not all of those lumens that lamp produces are necessarily going to exit the fixture in the visible spectrum. So things to kind of keep in mind. And then sort of the ultimate retrofit is to basically replace the whole thing, part and parcel, and start with a new fixture. Generally doesn't happen a whole lot in energy space, but in tenant improvements, this tends to be something to keep in mind as an option, especially if the existing fixture is not in the greatest shape or the use has changed significantly. So one of the great examples here is we did a lighting audit of a warehouse that they turned into an office space for a startup, and they had 400-watt metal halide acrylic high bays, and they were like, we're not really comfortable doing office tasks in here. Our eyes hurt. It's just not working for us. And it's kind of like, well, you moved into a warehouse, you probably should have retrofit the lighting at the same time. And so these are kind of the cases where the new luminaire retrofit might be a good call. General lamp advice is always purchase lamps rated for the installation application. That means if your fixture is going to be at risk of being wet, you want to make sure they're at least damp rated. For lamp retrofits, you're generally going to want to match the lumen output of the existing lamp to the new lamp. There are some cases where that's not the case, particularly where you're retrofitting, say, an omnidirectional lamp with a directional lamp. You don't need to match lumen output because presumably that directional lamp is going to get more light out of the fixture as a function, as a ratio of the nominal lamp lumens. I always tend to consider, I tend to discard lamp retrofits as an option when a more comprehensive retrofit is appropriate. So if the existing luminaires are particularly inefficient, like maybe they have egg crate diffusers, egg crate baffles, I might decide, based on the egg crate, we can probably actually do something a little bit more efficient with a door kit or maybe a new optical element or maybe a prismatic diffuser. If the operating hours are long, there's a better energy case for going and spending a little bit more money. Generally speaking, when the operating hours are long and you're going with a better, more comprehensive retrofit, you're also getting a product that lasts longer. So that means your maintenance interval is hopefully going to increase. And that's going to have a positive cash flow benefit on your maintenance costs. And then if the existing lighting installation is really not great to begin with, or maybe the fixture is damaged, those sorts of things, you might want to consider a full retrofit rather than trying to patch what would otherwise be a pretty poor quality light fixture. And then appropriate, the biggest thing is you want to control risk. There are a lot of products out there that put line voltage to lamp holders that may not have been line voltage prior to the retrofit. If that is the case, you want to make sure they're labeled and that you're training your site staff. Otherwise, you open yourself up to some liability involving workplace hazards and potential workman's comp claims. Generally speaking, one workman's comp claim is going to wipe out any of your energy savings. So you want to be a little cautious when you start talking about line voltage conversions. So when you're doing retrofit kits, things that I like to keep in mind is measuring your luminaires. Luminaires are going to have some differences in dimensions, and even if they look the same from the floor, inside that fixture they could be from different manufacturers with slightly different measurements. I've been burned on a few projects where you didn't do that, and so now it's in my standard operating practice. Generally speaking, low-cost kits will come at the cost of durability. The cost of metal is a significant component for a retrofit kit, and so often, and because you're using existing T-bar ceilings maybe to support things, you want to keep them as light as possible to not impact the structural integrity of the existing lighting system. And those are all very justifiable reasons to go with a lighter kit, a thinner gauge metal. That said, they also get damaged a whole lot easier in the field. So you want to make sure that as a contractor that they're being taken care of properly, that they're being shipped, and that you're inspecting them before you start installing them to make sure that they're still of sound structural quality, because that's going to reduce sort of punch list items and callbacks down the line. Always look for field replaceable drivers, especially in kits rated more than 50,000 hours. The electronic differences between a driver and a ballast are not that different. They're essentially just a high, sort of a high frequency transformer. They're converting AC voltage to DC voltage for the systems that they're running. So they have a lot of the same components that can go bad, primarily capacitors. In that case, they're going to last probably about the same amount of time, 50-ish thousand hours. So you want to make sure you're thinking about a driver replacement if you're expecting the lighting system to last more than 50,000 hours. Same thing, especially with field replaceable, is if you're doing any luminaires that are going to be installed behind drywall. We did a design review for an airport where they did a nice lighting system. They used 4-inch channel lights that were installed behind drywall. And we looked at the spec sheet during the design period, and we're like, guys, these cannot be maintained from the field. You have to access the driver from behind the drywall in order to replace it. And those fixtures are going to run 7,000 hours a year at this airport. They're in the main lobby. And so after 7 years, they would have had to have replaced all those drivers because you're getting it towards that 50,000 hour deadline, and there's no way of doing the maintenance from the ground. So when those fixtures have to get replaced or they have to get serviced, you're either cutting access hatches into the ceiling at 30 feet high, or you're ripping out the drywall to put in a new fixture. Both cases, very expensive activity. We want to make sure that doesn't happen as part of our projects. Other things to keep in mind are luminous aperture sizes. This is kind of a heady, nerdy topic, but when the ceiling is low, that means the distance between a viewer's eyes and that fixture is smaller. When that distance between the viewer's eye and a bright surface is small, that bright surface occupies a greater fraction of our visual field. When a bright surface occupies a large fraction of our visual field, we tend to experience that as it can be experienced as glare. It's kind of direct glare, light directly from the light source into your eye. It tends to be uncomfortable, which is why seeing a lot of these hockey puck downlight retrofits in residential applications where the ceilings tend to be pretty low makes me wince a little bit. Those can be a pretty glary source, so you want to make sure that you're controlling that. And then lumen matching, if you're matching the lamp lumens to a fixture lumen, you're probably going to overlight the space. If you want to do that, that's very conservative, and you're probably not going to have any light level issues. But you're going to want to check that out. I am running pretty behind, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit. Linear LEDs here, type A, B, and C. Type A uses the existing ballast. This is basically like you're doing a standard fluorescent relamping. Type B puts line voltage to your tombstones. This is going to be one of those fixtures you want to label, and you want to train the site maintenance staff that this is how it's going to work. Type C is going to use a driver as opposed to the linear fluorescent ballast, and that's going to be wired to your lamps. The one that I'm most concerned about are those Type Bs. When I can, I tend to avoid TLEDs. The light, appearance, uniformity, and optical efficiency tends to favor new luminaires or comprehensive retrofits. They're also not great for direct-indirect luminaires. So a lot of the more modern lighting designs that use direct-indirect pendants are probably not going to be a good fit for TLEDs, so you want to keep that in mind. If you're going to use TLEDs, budget for lamp holder replacement. Those lamps were adjacent to an ultraviolet light source in the fluorescent lamp, and that can embrittle the plastic. Brittle plastic means that the plastic snaps off and your conductors can be exposed, leading to shock hazards. If you're not going to replace your lamp holders, you probably want to avoid the Type B retrofit altogether. That's a little too much risk for my taste. Places where I think TLEDs are a fine substitution are linear high bays, strip luminaires, electrical closets, mechanical rooms, under cabinet lighting. These tend to be areas that don't have a whole lot of good optical control, making TLEDs a perfectly fine retrofit in these applications. With new luminaires, you want to be careful about eliminating or installing brighter luminaires. I've had a lot of folks when LEDs were sort of more expensive than they are today as a way of reducing costs. Instead of putting in a 2x4, they put in a 2x2 and put the same light output in that 2x2 as what was in that 2x4. You've just condensed that bright, or you've made that fixture twice as bright because you're putting the same amount of light through a 2x2 aperture. So that makes it appear brighter in the visual field. If you're gonna do a layout change, insist on a photometric model. You might be able to get that from a lighting consultant. You might be able to do it yourself. You might be able to get it from a lighting rep or manufacturer. If you're going to do that, you want to evaluate the new layout and make sure that that new layout is acceptable. You don't necessarily need to compare it to the existing. If you're using any programmable drivers, which is an increasing factor I'm seeing in new LED products, is you want to record the DC current and DC supply voltage, because both of those can tend to be adjustable. So that way, when there is an inevitable burnout, you're able to program it and provision that driver appropriately. That might be included in the luminaire submittals. I've already talked a little bit about downlights, so this is a little redundant. You can so this top fixture is what I was talking about as having a very shallow fixture body, and as a result you can see a lot of that luminous element. The bottom fixture has a slightly deeper fixture, which means it's probably a better fit for a low ceiling. And the middle fixture there is a pop-in retrofit with a full can. That's probably going to be the best in terms of optical control. You're not going to see the lighting elements in this fixture unless you're intentionally trying to look for it, which as a lighting nerd, I tend to do quite a bit. Troffer kits, I've already talked about this a little bit. So there's lay-in kits, which is kind of like the bottom one here, where you're putting the LED elements into the fixture pan, and then you're putting a door on the front. There are others that are bracket kits, like this top one, where you're basically texturing in a bracket that contains your light engine, your driver, and what's going to hold the lens and diffuser. And then you're going to have fixture kits where everything is basically super light and designed to sort of rock into the existing fixture pan. All of these are perfectly acceptable, depending on how dirty your environment is and how frequently it's going to need to be opened up to be wiped down. You might want to go with a more robust fixture. That's a maintenance discussion to have with the site. Luminaire dimensions. This is a narrative that goes with this picture. You're going to want to measure not only the interior dimensions, which are kind of where your lighting products are going to go, you're also going to want to measure the exterior dimensions and the depth. Getting all of these dimensions when you're assessing a site is going to give you everything you could possibly need for that retrofit dimension. Often manufacturers make specific bracket kits, if you're using a bracketed kit, to ensure things fit into as wide a range of fixture housings as possible. And knowing which one to order, you're going to need to gather some dimensions. When evaluating the costs of these things, you want to think about how a component retrofit versus an integrated retrofit, like a retrofit kit versus a lamp, is going to have an impact. A lot of the activities are going to be the same, whereas with the component retrofit, you're going to be doing some interior fixture rewiring, where with an integrated kit, you're probably going to have very little rewiring to be done. And you probably are going to be able to save a little bit of labor, which is going to help counteract some of that higher material cost. Mock-ups and models are a great thing to discuss. A mock-up is going to be installed in the space, and there's a little bit less risk associated with that because you're going to have less variables that you're going to make assumptions on. It's probably how, when you install it, that's how it's going to look in the space. If you're going to do a lighting model, you're going to have to gather a lot of details, and those will be included in the slides. I don't think I'm going to have the time to get through all of those. Spacing, this is a narrative that kind of goes with this slide here. This is a same size room, 15 by 20 foot room. We could put 2 downlights with 7,500 lumens and get a higher foot candle, or we could do 4 lower output troffers and get 30-foot candles. In practice, the space that has more wall washing is going to appear brighter and probably be more visually comfortable. So you want to keep these things in mind. Here's an example. This takes that model and puts it into a false color rendering, which shows you the uniformity of the colors against this scale. And then in this case, it's showing luminosity, or excuse me, luminance instead of foot candles. But the same metric holds true. This is an example project that we'll run through pretty quickly. Essentially, this is an old mezzanine office building in a manufacturing facility that had 1970s vintage pendants that were direct indirect 2-lamp T8. They were going to do they're moving new tenants in. They're going to demolish all the interior finishes, and we're like, should we look at the lighting? So here's an overhead view of that space, and I went ahead and I sketched in the primary side lit and secondary side lit daylighting zones. And what you see here is there's some daylighting, but not a ton, and the light fixtures are pretty dense. They're about 6 feet apart, so there's actually quite a bit of light in this space. So we want to look at reducing the number of luminaires. So we did some modeling. So here I put this is a 1-for-1 with sort of a standard output direct indirect LED fixture. And we got 211 foot candles. Here I changed the output to the lowest output that fixture would support, and I got it down to 100 foot candles, but we're still too high. So then I said, okay, well let's respace these fixtures out. And in doing so, we got to about 60 foot candles. But I was a little concerned when I looked at the model. You can't really see it in this picture, but the ceiling was pretty bright. There were some pretty bright striations. And so I did a false color rendering to show this to my client. And I said, well, if we put it at 10 foot 6 inches above the floor, which is where the existing fixtures are, we'll get these big, heavy red stripes on the ceiling. And that means that's going to be a much brighter surface than the surrounding sort of lime green color. If we reduce the fixture height to 9 foot above the floor, we're giving it more space to spread out that light, and the ceiling plane brightness becomes much more uniform. So we decided to lower the light fixtures a little bit. And then we looked at actually changing the room surface finishes from sort of a dark blue fabric colored wool to a light tan color. And again, we've got the same foot candles, we've lowered the light fixtures, and it all looks good. But it's still a little hot, and there was some concern from the customer about if that was still too high. So I modeled up putting in some cubicles, and this is what they were going to do in the space. And what happens is, now that we have all these partitions that are blocking the light, the average work plane illuminates goes down to 48 foot candles, which is right in line with what we want for a paper-based office. Some guiding principles for any lighting models is you want to make sure that you're not putting garbage in, because you'll get garbage out. So make sure you're including that lamp lumen depreciation and lamp dirt depreciation in your analysis. Field verify the surface reflectances. You're going to want to include the furniture plan because there's a lot of blocking that happens with furniture. And you're going to want to make sure all those assumptions are called out in your analysis. And you might consider evaluating luminance as well as illuminance. Luminance is going to help you identify potential glare problems. This is another quick example. I came in for a customer who's doing a tenant improvement and kind of knocked out a lighting model to say this is how many fixtures you should install. And once it came into post-install, they said the light was not enough. So I didn't walk the site. They asked me to do a model over the phone. When I walked the site, it turns out they had a coffered ceiling, sort of these 18-inch deep concrete waffle pattern in the ceiling. And the coffers ate all my light. They were actually responsible for reducing the light levels by about 15 foot candles. It also didn't help that the contractor had installed the wrong lighting system driver. So making sure to do a submittal review would have probably been a really good call on my part that I just didn't include in my scope of work. This is basically a narrative that describes what I just said. If possible, try and consider a life cycle cost evaluation. That is going to be your best case for evaluating, maybe spending a little bit more money on the first cost, and really conveying the true total cost to your customers. Try and keep it simple. Ask about maintenance strategies because those all impact where the cash flows occur. Make sure you enumerate your assumptions or list your assumptions, and because you're probably going to be eventually a lifecycle cost is going to escalate to some financial stakeholders, and those folks will probably have specific assumptions they want to make themselves. And if you're going to ascribe any improvements to being increasing productivity, I tend to keep those below 1% just because they are they tend to be very heavily influencing on the project. So just try and keep that as conservative as you can. It will have an outsized impact. A couple slides I'm going to try and get through here. Solicitations. Generally speaking, convey everything you know about the project in the solicitation. That helps make sure you're getting apples to apples bids between the contractors. And if you're doing anything that is weird or unique, do a job walk. That job walk is going to level the playing field quite a bit, and in doing so, make it easier for you to really get those apples to apples comparisons. And then before giving a notice to proceed to purchase materials, do a submittal review of everything we're submitting. When you're evaluating those submittals, make sure everything is detailed and that your control scope aligns with your lighting scope. It's really easy, given all the control systems that are out there, to mix things up or not specify the right dimming driver. So make sure you're coordinating those. And then any or equal substitutions need to be as well documented as the original documents. So if somebody is submitting an or equal on the lighting control system, I want to see that or equal come in with the sequence of operations and all the control options that are going to be submitted as part of that project, because the original design documents would have included all those things. On a similar note, make sure to evaluate the lighting controls, the lighting fixtures, and the plug load controls all together, because generally speaking, there's a lot of overlap there. And I've had some customers where they get an or equal on the lighting controls, but they don't consider the impact that that control change is going to have on their light fixtures and then on their plug load controls. So just make sure that everything aligns when you're doing those submittal reviews. And that is going to be the summary of best practices for lighting outs. I'm sorry it took a little longer than I intended. There's some slides here with some good resources that'll go out probably tomorrow. And with that, I want to thank you, and we'll start taking some questions. If you guys want to stick around, I'll stick around as long as I can to answer questions for you guys. All right, we'll go look at questions here. All right. Sorry, this is my first time using the GoToWebinar. Let's see. So let's see if we can't get this a little wider. All right. So Gotcha. Okay, so for 4-foot T8 lamp or lamp LED retrofits, what is your opinion on ballast versus drivers? My firm has had reservations on installing drivers with T8 LEDs due to newer technology and maintenance teams still being used to ballast. What is your opinion on the difference between Type A and Type C? Type A and Type C, for the most part, the wiring details are going to be slightly different for a Type C. It's going to vary between manufacturer to manufacturer. So I would encourage you to look at those from that perspective. And if the differences are really significant and maybe you don't have as well trained a maintenance team, you might want to have a Type A retrofit for that application. If you have a maintenance team that's sort of on the ball, super knows what they're doing, or maybe they use a third-party maintenance provider, a lighting maintenance contractor, then I don't see a reason not to use the Type C. Honestly, it doesn't have a big impact on efficiency, and I haven't seen it make a big impact on delivered operations or maintenance efficiencies. All right, let's look at some more here. Yeah, so another question about TLEDs. What's the difference between, or what's my opinion on plug and play versus direct wire and flicker issues with direct wire? Generally speaking, if you're going to use direct wire, you always want to do a mock-up. The manufacturing variance between a direct wire TLED and all the various and sundry ballasts that are out there is going to be really hard to verify on sort of an industry-wide basis. So whenever I have a customer who's doing a plug-and-play TLED retrofit, I'm suggesting that they do a mock-up. I tend to not recommend a direct wire just because of shock risks and the fact that now you're running line voltage to things that didn't used to be line voltage, potentially with people who are not super well trained. So it's a risk that I don't feel comfortable accepting. I certainly have clients who don't mind the risk, so I just try and make sure that they're provided all the information and then make that decision. Yeah, so again, this gets to that often repeated statement that on-off cycles don't affect LED products is a myth. Yeah, I'd say it's a myth. On-off cycles is always going to have an impact on products. Now, is it going to have as dramatic of an impact as you might see on a T8 lamp, where on-off cycles going from 30 minutes to 5 minutes is probably going to reduce your lamp life from 20,000 hours to 5,000 hours? No, it's not going to be that bad. But it probably is going to put additional wear on the electronic components. It's probably going to have less of an impact on integral LED fixtures that have drivers and LED engines and sort of been designed from the ground up for LEDs, because you're giving people more space to work with for that driver, so you're getting better components and you're getting better heat rejection. It's probably going to be, on the whole, a more robust system than, say, a 2-foot TLED that has to fit a driver in a half-inch tall space 2 feet long, with a price point of $5, $6, $7. At that point, you're having to make a lot of product sacrifices to make that pencil out cost effectively. So you want to kind of keep those things in mind when you're making those changes. Generally speaking, On and off cycles should probably not be more than 5 minutes if you're using occupancy sensors, because once you get below 5 minutes, people start getting annoyed a lot easier, and at that point you're probably not going to have as big an issue. Yes, slides for this presentation will be made available tomorrow. The person who's going to hand out the slides had to leave a little early today, but they will be made available in a PDF format. All right. Let's see, lots of questions about the slides, so I've answered those. Okay, yeah, so suggestions for not overlighting spaces. So the biggest thing here, so there's a balancing act with overlighting, right? When we go into a building, we want to provide, we don't want to come in with 100 different light fixtures to light one building, so we can tune every space to the exact light levels they need. So we're probably going to make some simplifications to our lighting design. Or we might come in with 12 light fixtures for our building, and we're going to pick the appropriate lumen package for all 12 of those fixtures for the highest light level demand. And so that's going to result in a lot of our spaces being overlit. So there's a couple ways of handling that. First is to install room controllers in each of our rooms, and then task tuning the rooms as appropriate. If controls aren't on the table, and you're not going to have the ability to program your zones, you can ask for tunable drivers that can be programmed either at the factory, and component-wise they're going to be the same. They're going to have the same SKU, but they're going to be programmed slightly differently at the factory. Now that kind of defers sort of that programming cost to that first time that driver has to get replaced. Once that driver gets replaced, it's going to be shipped from the factory for the nominal drive current, and so you will at that point have to provide or program in the field that drive current to what that fixture actually needs in order to provide the appropriate light level for the space. In terms of figuring out what is overlit, what is underlit, my general approach is to design for IES recommended practices, and then include maybe a week or two after the space has been retrofit and is occupied, include a follow-up site visit where you're going in and you're working with the tenants or the occupants to figure out what light levels are comfortable. Generally speaking, I've done some research projects where we found that people want task tuning often above and beyond what the IES calls for visual acuity. So there's some good savings to be had there. You just need the controls in order to do it. Yeah, so again, a TLED's a T8, yeah, is a TLED, our TLED's a T8 type linear lamps. Can you repeat why they're not a good selection for retrofit? Yeah, so in my opinion, TLEDs are not the greatest selection for retrofit, primarily because they rely on the existing fixture optics, and those existing fixture optics can be pretty inefficient. They're not a good fit for direct and indirect pendants because they only generally produce light in one direction. Be very careful when you see lamps that report a 320-degree beam angle. It's actually a 320-degree field angle. What you get above maybe 220, what you get above maybe 170 to that 320 angle, the light that comes out of that sort of radial section is generally about 10% of the total lamp lumens. So you're not going to get a whole lot of uplight out of those lamps, so I'd be careful. And the other thing is, and so this is sort of an approach I have with a lot of my larger portfolio customers, is once they go to the TLED, there's not really going to be an energy basis for going anywhere further. The TLED, you're dropping that fixture wattage down to maybe 30 watts a fixture, maybe a little less. At that point, you don't have a whole lot of maneuvering room to do any more lighting upgrades in the future, just given the cost of labor and the cost of energy. So if they want to do something comprehensive, and they're looking at TLEDs as sort of a bridging technology until they can muster the capital to do a whole fixture retrofit. At that point, once you're a TLED, there's not a whole lot of room to get more energy savings. So I encourage them to go big if they're going to do a retrofit, and they have the financial wherewithal to get it done. I sort of view TLEDs as sort of a band-aid for people who might not be able to justify any other types of retrofit. All right. Yeah, so good question about job walk. Job walk kind of depends on your, so job walk, does it mean a bidder meeting on site or just a designer visit? That's a great question. And it's going to depend on your project delivery model. If you're competitively bidding the design portion, yeah, it could be a job walk with the lighting designers. They might call it a programming walk. What I tend to think of as a job walk is walking the site specifically with contractors, the persons who are going to bid on actually implementing the work. And the things we're going to look at is we're going to talk about the scope of work. We're going to discuss what's in the scope of work. We'll then walk relevant portions of the site to give them a feel for where the scope of work is going to be initiated or conducted. And if there's anything odd, like maybe, for example, I did some job walks at high school and we were talking about retrofitting the lighting in the auditorium, and they had a very odd catwalk system for retrofitting the lighting in the auditorium. We were going with some rather expensive lighting products. That was like a highlight for our job walk, because we really wanted to see that, because we knew that it wouldn't be sort of as cookie cutter as maybe the lighting retrofits in the classroom. So we're looking at sort of those oddball projects that we want to highlight on that job walk. We're also getting questions from the contractors, and we're writing those down, because what might occur to one contractor, another contractor may be making some assumptions. So after that job walk, I'm preparing a bid addendum or basically an RFI response that says, these are questions that were asked during the job walk. Here are our answers. So that way everybody's sort of working from those same assumptions. And that, again, helps us get those apples to apples bids. So explaining again why I don't like Type B TLEDs, my biggest complaint is the line voltage to the tombstones. The tombstones are nominally rated for 600 volts, which means they should be able to handle 120 volts, no problem. 277 volts, no problem. However, when you look at the time response of a T8 lamp, they're getting those 600 volts for a fraction of a second, and then it drops down to an operating voltage that's far, far lower than 600 volts. And so the voltage, warranty is something that I'm not sure I super buy into. Second thing is that those little plastic chunks that maybe go for 50 cents a piece are not super well designed, and over time, if they've been installed for 10, 15 years, those have been installed in very close proximity to a fluorescent lamp. When you're within about an inch of a fluorescent lamp, there is a small fraction of ultraviolet light that is released that, in most applications, is going to depreciate before it reaches a human being working in space. But at that close, that ultraviolet light will break down some of the plastic in the tombstone, which will cause it to become brittle. When it becomes brittle, anytime you're removing the lamps, you run the risk of cracking the plastic and exposing a conductor. And that exposed conductor may not be immediately obvious to a less well-trained technician. And so when they're doing that lamp replacement, they might come in contact with a contact with that electrical conductor, and as a result, suffer a shock. Is it going to kill anybody? No, but it could be enough of a surprise that they fall off a ladder and get hurt. In that case, we're probably talking about a workman's comp claim, and just the marginal benefit from what you stand to save going a direct wire ballast versus the risk that I think we're signing off on as professionals is probably not worth it. At least it's not worth it to me. Everyone is entitled to make their own judgment calls. And so, yeah, so there's another good question. In many of our retrofit projects, a one-for-one TLED or fixtures, we are receiving complaints of too much light. Other than task tuning, how would you recommend addressing this issue, considering $300 of the 330-300 overview? Great question. So there's a couple ways of doing it. One is you can evaluate during a mock-up whether or not a one-for-one retrofit is absolutely necessary. If you're going to do TLED, you might try doing a TLED with a reflector kit that would reduce the number of lamps in a 2x4 fixture from 3 to 2, or from 4 to 3. And those are really inexpensive, and what's really nice is they all kind of come pre-wired. So all you're doing is you're texturing it into the fixture, connecting the quick disconnect, and then installing the lamps. So that's one way of assessing it, is doing a mock-up beforehand and evaluating whether that's acceptable or not. You don't have to do a mock-up on a whole floor. You can do it in like a private office, a conference room, someplace that's indicative. Second thing to think about, particularly with your retrofit kits, not necessarily just your lamps, is you want to think about, again, aperture size. A lot of what we perceive as being too much light or too bright is the change in how bright the fixture aperture is to a person in the space. And so if you look at a lot of the LED retrofits, what they'll do is they'll actually take and they'll condense maybe all the light emitting portion of that fixture into a 6-foot wide, 4-foot long optic. And then the rest of the fixture is sort of, just sort of reflector, doesn't have a whole lot of optical characteristic to it. And so you're condensing what used to be a 2-foot by 4-foot aperture to a 6-inch by 4-foot aperture. That 6-inch by 4-foot aperture is going to have a whole lot more light density and will appear a lot brighter. So if you're going to do that, you might consider, instead of doing the retrofit with that rather small aperture, that you do a retrofit with a bigger aperture. That might mean maybe use some of the more prismatic retrofits rather than some of the retrofits that look a little bit more volumetric. It's a way of sort of controlling that brightness. Other things you can think about are controlling the amount of light that is emitted above 60 degrees. Generally speaking, light above 60 degrees, not only did it cause glare back in the days of CRT monitors, but it also caused direct glare into people's eyes. So that's a way of selecting a product that might not have as much glare. Can I provide a link to a white paper on lamp holders and old lamp holders? I do not have a white paper. All I have is a lot of firsthand experience dealing with lamp holders kind of crumbling in my fingers. I think if you look at sort of if you Google brittle T8 lamp holders, you'll probably get some hits off of that. Good question here about how are plug load controllers influenced by lighting controls. Great question. So, and this might be a little bit particular to my experience in California, where we have plug load controls included in our statewide energy code. That might not be everywhere, but we have a requirement that requires any plug loads, any receptacle pair either has to be a split receptacle with one controlled receptacle and one uncontrolled receptacle on 24/7, one that's on only during a normal, like an occupied period. Or we have to have within, I think it's 6 feet of an uncontrolled receptacle, we also have to have a controlled receptacle. many times, especially in TIs where they're trying to keep costs low and not run new conduit, what they're doing is they're doing wireless receptacle controls that talk to the lighting control system. And so when you change the receptacles on the lighting control system, when you change lighting control manufacturers, now you have to come up with a new plug load control strategy. So case in point, I had a customer who had a lighting control system that used that same wireless approach. All the control plugs in any given office would be paired with the occupancy sensors for that office. And so when the occupancy said, hey, we're unoccupied, the plugs would shut off. All that had to be done is they wired everything like they normally did, and then they plugged in the plug load control. Basically, they plugged in the special wireless receptacle pair into the junction box, or into the wall box. Not a big problem. The or equal was that they were going to replace the lighting control system, and instead of having the receptacle control in the receptacle box, the plug load control was now wired to the junction box above the ceiling. And so as a result, when the electrician came in and had to wire that room, he had to run essentially two sets of conductors. One set of conductors that went to the uncontrolled receptacles, and one set of conductors that went to the controlled receptacles. Those conductors that went to the controlled receptacles then got tied into the plug load controller that was above the ceiling. So now that office had to have twice as many conductors installed because of how they decided to do plug load controls as part of this or equal. That cost impact was not captured in the or equal and got actually captured in a change order. And as a result, they spent more money. The project didn't save as much money as they thought it was going to from doing that sort of value engineering swap out of control manufacturers. A question here about what are some lighting software systems used for doing, I'm assuming, lighting models to make sure the lighting system meets the light levels in the space. Great question. I'm going to give you a bunch of product names. So Visual, VISUAL, is probably the least expensive sort of professional grade lighting modeling software. Probably the most popular lighting software in North America would probably be AGI 32. It's going to be a little bit more expensive than Visual. And then used in Europe and made available for free is a program called Dialux, DIALUX, and that's also a lighting photometric modeling software. So you basically build the room kind of like you do in CAD, and then you drag in a .IES file for your appropriate light fixture, and then that's going to tell the modeling software how that fixture emits light in what directions and what quantity, and then you can model light levels in space. What tools do I bring with me when I go to do a site assessment? Great question. My toolkit for lighting audits is pretty simple. I'm bringing a clipboard. I'm bringing scads of paper. Hopefully, I got a reflected ceiling plan from the owner. If not, I'm bringing the site egress plan because that usually shows all the doors and walls and things, which is a leg up on starting to take a lighting inventory. I'm usually taking a mirror, which allows me to kind of poke up into suspended direct and indirect fixtures to figure out how many lamps there are in those fixtures. I might take a selfie stick that I can put my camera on and again take pictures of what's on top of those light fixtures. Makes my junior engineers a little embarrassed, but it works pretty well. And then I'm going to take a light meter always, and if it's an industrial audit with a lot of process equipment, I'm going to take a temperature meter to measure the temperature where the light fixtures are. In doing so, I'm making sure I'm getting the right temperature correction factor, and I'm depreciating the product life as much as possible. I'm also going to take a laser distance meter if I expect I'll be doing a lighting model later on, and I'm going to measure the dimensions of the room. I'm going to measure the window head height to figure out what my daylighting zones are, and I'm probably going to measure any substantial barriers or partitions, kind of like cubicle walls. And then for working inside of light fixtures, I'm taking a regular tape measure. Because I have the laser distance meter with me, I'm probably not taking like a 25-foot tape measure. I'm probably taking an 8-foot tape measure, which is probably going to be enough for working inside of a light fixture with a laser tape measure available if I need it. I already answered the lighting modeling software. I use AGI 32, so all the visuals you saw in this presentation were from AGI 32. For office areas, what LED color temperature do you recommend when working on a retrofit? For stairwells, maintenance, and basements, we use 4K, but tenants, what we found with tenants, they like 3500K. What is your opinion? So my opinion is there's a school of thought in the lighting retrofit is that high color temperature tends to be correlated with perceived visual brightness based on a physiological response where when a human eye is exposed to more blue light, the pupil constricts, which increases the visual acuity of the eye, allowing people to see better. Dr. Sam Berman from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab did a whole bunch of research about that in the 90s. Late 80s, early 90s. It's a physiological response that I think is I experience it myself. And I used to push that as a way of saying, well, we can provide less light if we're providing cooler light. But given the preponderance of task tuning and the efficiency of light sources themselves, I don't see a whole lot of benefit in doing it, particularly if it's going to make people upset. So I tend to defer to what my client wants. If they give me absolutely no feedback whatsoever, I'm going with 4,000 Kelvin. If they have a standard, I will use what their standard is. And 3,500 Kelvin is a standard that I think a lot of folks like to use. I'd say that's probably the most popular interior color temperature in commercial offices is 3,500 Kelvin. I would use some words of caution, particularly around healthcare facilities and senior living facilities. There's some really interesting research around circadian rhythms that show that those folks probably need to have more blue light during the day and substantially less blue light at night. But if you're interested in that research, I think it's RP 37 is the recommended practice for senior living and low vision populations, which talk about that in a lot of detail. That's where we have the most concrete recommendations available. And that I would refer to that document if I was going to try and develop some recommendations around it. How does color rendering index affect visual quality and reflect true color? Color rendering index is hugely important, but it's probably going to go away here in the next 5-6 years. I think I've been saying that for the last 8 years. Color rendering index is a metric that looks at 8 color swatches. There are 15 color swatches available. However, when it comes to reporting the CRI, they're only really reporting those 8 color swatches, not all 15. Those colors are kind of desaturated pastel colors. They're not super saturated colors. And you want to provide a modicum of good color rendering. Right? Today, there's no reason why your interior lighting shouldn't be CRI at 80 or above. Does going to CRI 90 really have a positive benefit on visual acuity or perception of color? It depends. Because CRI is based on only 8 colors, it's really easy to game the score you can really tune your lighting system to get a high CRI score but not be a very good color renderer, which is why the IES and the CIE, the International Committee of Lighting, are putting their heads together around a new lighting metric that you might see out there called TM30. It reports gamut and fidelity. And that metric is a lot better because it uses 99 samples, and it's all done with mathematics. So it's not like they're using 99 swatches on each light fixture to test it. They're running it through a mathematical model. And in doing so, it's a lot harder to game the system, and it's a lot more representative of what people experience. And so what they found is that while CRI punishes over-rendering and under-rendering, they have this concept with the TM30 where they can positively value some slight supersaturation of colors, which people appreciate from a vibrancy perspective, even though it's not perfectly rendered. It is perceived as positive. And then they have gamut, which is more akin to the conventional CRI, still using 99 swatches, but it doesn't positively weight supersaturation. Favorite lighting audit tool bag, I just talked about that. How does CRI figure into my lighting upgrade direction? I'm always telling people minimum CRI 80. I do have some clients who want CRI 90, and then they decided to write CRI 90 into their spec. And then they come to me and say, do we really need CRI 90? I don't know that you do outside of some very specific applications like retail or spaces that have a preponderance of colors that you really want to render well. Generally speaking, in a commercial kitchen that prepares red meat, I'm always going to insist on having a positive R9, which is not included in the CRI metric. The counterpoint to higher CRI or warmer color temperatures is that the efficacy of the light source goes down the higher the CRI is. Why? The CRI efficacy of the light source is defined based on the lumen, right? And that lumen is defined at a peak wavelength of 555 nanometers, which is in sort of the neon lime green region. When we're trying to increase color rendering, we are increasing light output in areas of that curve that don't count quite as much for determining the definition of a lumen. So when we spend electrical energy to make the red appear redder or make the violet appear more violet, those ends of the color spectrum don't contribute nearly as much to defining a lumen. So the light source efficacy goes down, even though we're making use of that light in a productive way. The metric for lumens per watt does not capture it. All right, I think I've gotten through all the questions. Is anybody at AEE there wanting to say any closing words?
Yeah, hi, this is Michelle Whitlock. I can just close it out. Thank you so much, James, for giving your presentation and answering all of those questions. I think like Sharon said earlier, and you noted, we will send out the presentation slides in a PDF format. If you happen to miss those or don't get the email, you can just send a request to Sharon at aeecenter.org to get those. And I guess if there's any other questions that anyone has, you can also reach out to Sharon. And thank you all for attending, and be sure to check our website for future webinars for members. And I hope everyone has a great Tuesday night.
Thanks, guys. Pleasure. Feel free to contact me.
All right, thank you.